All right, welcome to chapter 18. This chapter is going to deal with the same time period as chapter 17. So while everything that we described in chapter 17 is going on in the West, cattle ranching, agribusiness, mining booms, Indian wars, and things like that, this is what's going on in the eastern part of the country, and this is the real kickoff of industrialization. You sort of get the beginnings of industrialization happening in the period before the Civil War, but it doesn't really kick off until the period after the Civil War. And so that's what this chapter is going to concern itself with, industrialization and the accompanying political problems that went with industrialization, or at least touching on some of the problems that went with industrialization. So, there are basically 6 features that dominated the world of large-scale manufacturing. The first of these involved the exploitation of coal deposits, coal being used to power the power plants, which ultimately power the factories. And without finding sufficient amounts of coal, it would be very difficult for you to run industrial machines and things like that. The second of these is the rapid spread of technological innovation in things like transportation, communication, as well as the factory system in general, which all make large-scale industrialization possible. The demand for controllable workers, meaning the increase of immigration, becomes a big part of enabling industrialization. On top of that, you have constant competitive pressure within industries to the idea to sort of outdo your competitors, to gain more business than your competitors, ultimately leading to the establishment of things like trusts and monopolies. The relentless drop in prices also follows. Competition usually results in falling prices. Falling prices usually results in falling wages as well. The failure of the money supply to keep up with productivity. So essentially, the manufacturers are outproducing the demand. Essentially, supply is running far ahead of demand, and this results in greatly depressed prices because the market is essentially flooded with items. And all of these were very closely related to one another. The coal deposits fueled the railroads as well as factories. New technology stimulated productivity. Factories became much more efficient and also catalyzed expansion of factories. Innovation also allowed for manufacturers to cut costs and to hire cheap labor was a part of cutting costs, essentially. Cost cutting also fed competition. And all of these forces, which resulted in competition, ultimately also resulted in depressed prices. The growing demand also stimulated production, and then overproduction would also, in turn, lead to depressed prices. Above all, this dynamic also created massive fortunes, at least at the very top of society, and impoverished those at the bottom. So those who own the industrial factories and things like that are making huge profits off of this particular system. But those who are working in the factories, the workers who are having to deal with reduced wages, layoffs because of decreased demand for the product, and things like that, find themselves being forced into poverty as a result of all of this. The competition was probably the most intense among the railroads. Entrepreneurs faced huge financial and organizational problems, and obtaining the funds needed to lay track was probably the biggest hurdle that you had to overcome. They obtained land and subsidies from the government and also borrowed heavily from investors by selling stocks and bonds to cover the cost of laying the track. By 1900, the combined debt of the railroads, of all the railroads, was $5.1 billion. And to put that into perspective, the entire national debt for the government of the United States was only $1.1 billion. So the railroads had nearly 5 times as much debt as the national government did. And that cut very badly into their earnings because that debt had to be repaid. They needed to create new systems for collecting as well as using information. They relied on magnetic telegraph to coordinate the flow of cars and set up clearly defined hierarchical structures within their organizations, and also elaborate accounting systems to keep documented records of the costs of running their businesses, all in an effort to try and make it run more efficiently so as to cut costs wherever it was possible. Expansion and consolidation of the railroad reflected both ingenuity as well as a fair amount of dishonesty. Despite innovation and organization, industry remained chaotic. In 1870, you had different standards for track width being used by different companies. Entrepreneurs would buy up smaller lines and then organize them into systems, replacing tracks that were of the wrong width, and various things like that. All these systems essentially worked, I suppose, like a tree, where you would have your trunk line, your major line. Usually these were lines that were going west, east to west, or north to south. They would go to cardinal directions. And then you would have smaller sort of branch lines that would go off of these and go to individual towns and cities and things like that. As these entrepreneurs gobbled up the smaller lines, you see the consolidation of the railroad by the 1890s into the hands of 5 massive companies. These 5 companies control pretty much all of the railroad lines in the United States. A few of them you may even be able to name if you are at all familiar with a monopoly board. Expansive railroad moguls were quite often seen as villains and earned the nickname robber barons that would manipulate markets in order to line their own pockets. Many of them were corrupt, but many of them were also very shrewd innovators. Railroad systems became the largest business operations in the world. They created integrated systems by standardizing basic equipment and facilities so that trains from different companies could run on the same tracks. Or rather, companies that built train cars could sell their train cars to any of the railroad companies. They also developed signal systems to make the running of the trains much more efficient and established time zones in order to standardize train schedules throughout the country. And actually, the system was adopted globally. Systemization did have its cost, though. Indebtedness, overextended systems, crooked business practices, runaway competition, where they would cut rates selectively for certain customers. All of this drove the lines into bankruptcy. Farmers and small business owners often lost in this atmosphere of excessive competition and so turned to the government for help. Midwestern states also responded by outlawing things like rate discrimination, but decisions in the Supreme Court were not uniformly upheld or uniformly decided even, much less upheld. In 1887, Congress finally responded to these sort of calls for regulation with the passage of the Interstate Commerce Act, which in turn established the Interstate Commerce Commission, which was charged with overseeing the practices of the railroads. The act technically banned monopolistic activity, but it didn't really go away until the Depression of 1893 hit, and a lot of banks, or rather a lot of railroads went bankrupt. Control of the railroads then were gobbled up by bankers like J.P. Morgan, who bought up large numbers of railroads and basically overhauled the system. You also have a close connection existing between the railroad and the growing steel industry, I suspect for obvious reasons. The biggest name in the steel industry was a Scottish immigrant by the name of Andrew Carnegie, which is actually how you pronounce his name, if you're going to say it sort of properly like a Scottish person might. He was kind of the epitome of your sort of rags to riches story. In the 1870s, after working a series of odd jobs and investing his money wisely, he built a steel mill where he produced high-grade steel, and using the brand new Bessemer process, which had been discovered, was able to make efficiently steel products at a relatively low price or low cost to him, and became wildly successful as a result. He combined this new technology with cost analysis as his sort of successful business model. He wasn't above, however, asking for favors from railroad buddies in order to drive out his competition. He used vertical integration to create a mass production system that could increase production as well as drive down prices. His factory ran like a well-oiled machine, and that left him to pursue various philanthropic pursuits. He donated to charitable projects. He founded libraries and universities, various things like that. There are some Carnegie libraries here in Texas. I know there's one in Jefferson, and I suspect there may be one closer by as well, though I can't remember where it is. But we're directly funded by Andrew Carnegie. Carnegie Steel became the largest industrial corporation in the United States, and several competitors attempted to buy him out. Eventually, Carnegie wanted to retire, and so he sought to actually sell his factory. And so here we have, or his operation rather, more than one factory. And so you have J.P. Morgan coming back on the scene, and he buys up Carnegie Steel. He pays about $492 million, a good chunk of that going directly to Carnegie as a result of the sale. And he combines that with other steel-related businesses that he's bought up. He bought Carnegie's closest competitor in the steel business. He also bought up various sort of tangential businesses, shipping companies, producers of finished steel products, coal mines, and things like that, and pushed them all together to form one giant corporation, which was called U.S. Steel. Carnegie is often portrayed as his success being the result of hard work and determination. However, that's not entirely the full story as to how things tended to work in the industrial sort of wilderness of late 19th century America. The fierce competition that characterized the railroad and the steel industries also took hold of other industries like oil, salt, sugar, and various things like that. All of these also required huge capital investment, and all of them also sought to drive competitors out of the market. The oil industry illustrates the evolution of a new corporate structure quite well. People would flock to the new industry. Petroleum could be easily distilled into a variety of products that could be used for a variety of services. The most popular petroleum product in the late 19th century was kerosene, which was used for lighting. By the 1870s, the landscape near Pittsburgh and Cleveland were littered with wells and holding tanks, and oil spills were a constant problem in that area, as those are sort of the two capitals of the oil industry. Rockefeller, J.D. Rockefeller, gradually achieved dominance in the oil industry by buying up a lot of his competitors or otherwise putting them out of business. He realized then that small changes in a massive business venture could save thousands of dollars. He also understood the inner workings of his industry and the value of vertical integration. In 1882, with the help of some financial and business advisors, he set up a new form of corporate organization that was designed to eliminate competition. And this became known as the Standard Oil Trust. The trust acted as an umbrella corporation that ran a lot of smaller ones that comprised the market. And through this device, he managed to integrate the industry both vertically and horizontally by merging competing companies together under one organizational title. Standard justified the trust by pointing out the public usefulness of it. The oil industry, the argument went, was chaotic at best before the introduction of Standard Oil Trust. And arguably, the trust was useful as far as that went. Other trusts turned out to not be quite so useful. For example, the Tobacco Trust used its influence to target young kids and to persuade them to smoke cigarettes. Other industries established their own trusts, and their unscrupulous practices and monopolistic control eventually provoked a public outcry. Hoping to restore competition, Congress passed the Sherman Antitrust Act, which outlawed trusts and other monopolies and charged violators with fines. It failed, however, though, to clearly define what a trust was or what restraint of trade meant, and the act was effectively emasculated by the Supreme Court decision United States versus E.C. Knight and Company. By 1900, these massive firms accounted for nearly 2/5 of all capital investment in manufacturing. What I have here now are a series of pictures which portrays the kind of public debate that was going on with regards to trust. So this first one here is a picture coming out of Harper's Weekly, as the watermark at the bottom would indicate. Harper's was a fairly highbrow, kind of conservatively minded political periodical, that operated in the late 19th century, and in fact it still operates today. You could still buy copies of Harper's Weekly should you wish to. And this particular magazine is going to be your sort of bastion, defending the rights of industrialists and things like that. And this image kind of speaks to that position. Here you have depicted Uncle Sam on the right, who was being reassured by the figure of Andrew Carnegie. Carnegie, if you see him in caricature, will almost always have some element of tartan about him, denoting, of course, his Scottish heritage. But he's standing there in his suit with the tartan overcoat next to a rather fearsome-looking beast. And it's this beast, the lion at the bottom, is Carnegie at the bottom saying that the public may regard trusts or combinations with serene confidence. And this was a line that he gave in an interview with the New York Times on August 9th of that year that it was published. And here you have, which is essentially part of a larger defense by industrialists of their creations, which are these monopolies and trusts. And in fact, Carnegie actually wrote an essay, which is in our reading, I believe, defending the creation of trusts and defending the idea. And while a trust run by Andrew Carnegie is easier to swallow because Carnegie was sort of uncommonly virtuous in that sense, one must question whether the motives of all owners of trusts or monopolies would be quite as pure as Carnegie's. And in that sense, some of his arguments that he makes in his essay are undermined because they, in fact, really only apply to him. The next image we have here is one that represents a far more vilified trust corporation. This one not appearing in Harper's, although I'm not entirely sure as to which publication it did appear in. But you get a very different image of trusts and monopolies and their sort of role in society. Here you have a beast, a many-tentacled beast. It sort of looks like a demented elephant a little bit, or something like a cross between an elephant and an octopus. I'm not entirely sure. But the label at the top says Standard Oil. And you can see it's sitting on top of holding tanks and derricks and refining factories and things like that. And it's got its little paws around nearly everyone. So here you have a ship out in the sea at the very back, which is being sort of strangled and slowly sunk by the tentacles of this mighty beast. You have arms around the various parts of government here, represented here on the left and right, respectively. And you also have this tentacle at the bottom left reaching out and hoping to take over what appears to be the White House. You also have various individuals here. Some of them are very well dressed, which leads me to believe that they might be congressmen or senators or people like that who are bought off or otherwise encouraged to do things in favor of the monopoly. And it's very sinister looking. He has very sort of sinister eyes. The idea that it's this sort of monstrous beast of a creature all makes it rather terrifying. And it is a good visual of the kind of concern that these sorts of organizations ignited as far as the public was concerned. The third of these images also deals with Standard Oil. This is called The Trust Giant's Point of View, What a Pussy Little Government, I believe is the subtitle there. The trust giant being portrayed here is John D. Rockefeller, who was the owner of Standard Oil, and in fact the creator of Standard Oil. You can see in the foreground it's completely lined with oil barrels and things like that. In the background you can see refineries, and you can also see the Congress building in Washington, which has been turned into a refinery. The implication being that congressmen have been bought off or otherwise influenced by these robber barons, as they're called. Here as well, you get an image of what I believe is intended to be the Supreme Court this time, with all the little justices underneath it, and Rockefeller is seen stuffing money bags into the Supreme Court in order to buy a favorable ruling in a court case having to do with it. I'm not entirely sure of the year that this was published, and so I couldn't actually comment on the court case in question. Rockefeller as well, much like the sort of evil beast in the previous image, Rockefeller has a kind of sinister look about him. He's got one of those looking glass things that you might see jewelers wear, which sort of magnifies. It makes it easier for them to see sort of delicate settings and things like that. He's got that on, which sort of implies that he's so big that he can't even sort of see properly what what the rest of the world sees, or what the rest of the world looks like or is doing. And again, you get a sort of overwhelming sense of fear from looking at this image and what it represents as well. The last image I have to look at sort of speaks to ideas that were presented in the previous two images. The ideas of these trust owners and robber barons or monopolists or whatever. The idea that they have control over the government, either through money or influence or both, is expressed very keenly in this particular picture. Here you have the Senate chambers, each of the senators sitting at their individual desks, all working away quite doggedly. And back behind them, you have the looming presence of the monopolists, as they're labeled. And you have sort of the thing at the top right, which says this is the entrance for monopolists. And you have various monopolies or trusts represented here as well. You have the Steel Beam Trust, the Nail Trust just coming in, the Copper Trust. The Standard Oil Trust is in stripes, or prison stripes, which would indicate that Standard Oil was broken up, or was determined to be against the law, which it was eventually determined to be against the law in that sense. But you have various others, the Sugar Trust, the coal, paper, iron, all of those different groups being represented there. They're sort of rotund, and they have sort of massive ruffles around their necks. They're intended to look like money bags in that sense, indicating that the primary method for getting the Senate to do what they want is to bribe them monetarily. This image does appear in Puck, which was essentially the liberal answer to the conservative Harper's Week. If Harper's was a sort of bastion of conservatism and industrialists and the wealthy, then Puck was much more of the people, much more common in the material that it issued. And so it tended to be much more liberal in subject matter and in its commentary with regards to these kind of images. So all important information to know whenever looking at cartoons. Knowing where they're published gives you quite an insight oftentimes. Right, new inventions also streamlined manufacture and stimulated demand by creating new product lines. Many of these were hidden from public view, and very few heard about new technology for doing things like improving bottle making or flour milling or petroleum refining. They merely enjoyed the results of those improved methods. The ones that people did see, however, did change the patterns of everyday life, things like the introduction of sewing machines, of the telephone, and of the light bulb. All of these serve to ease household chores and also to reshape social interactions as they existed. In the eyes of many, Edison epitomized the inventive impulse and the capacity for creating new products. His first major invention was the stock quotation printer, and he managed to earn enough through the sale of that invention to fund an invention factory. He set out after that to develop a new and much more reliable filament for the light bulb. The light bulb itself had already been invented, in fact, by a British inventor, but the filament used to light the light bulb, actually, wasn't very reliable, and it would burn up after a minute or two, which meant that the light bulb was not a terribly practical invention at that point. And so Edison sought to improve the light bulb by finding a filament that would work better. He realized that electric lighting had to be part of a complete system, however, with generators and meters and wiring and everything like that. Once he had sort of hit upon an effective filament, he realized that in order to make it marketable, this is something that he would need to do, would be to set up the rest of the system. And so he partnered with J.P. Morgan, yet again in 1882, to open the Edison Illuminating Company in New York City, and he serviced about 80 patrons in New York City as a result of this. His inventing park, or invention factory, I suppose, was at Menlo Park, was the address in New York City. And after he came up with the filament for his light bulb, he also decided to essentially advertise his electric light bulbs and get into the holiday spirit as well by installing lights, a dozen or so lights, around the yard of his factory there at Menlo Park at Christmas time. And people came from all over to see the wonder of Edison's electric lights out at his factory. Manufacturers of specialized products also expanded their economic output, used skilled labor in order to manufacture a variety of products. Small dressmaking shops, for example, would make custom clothing, and this is sort of typical of the sort of small batch processors that fall into this category. These small batch processors tended to operate right alongside bigger businesses like steel and oil, and provided a variety of goods that supplemented bulk manufactured staples. Both large and small producers made so many products that output quite often exceeded demand. Particularly good for mass-produced goods became those companies became kind of trailblazers for marketing techniques. Excuse me, sorry, I got lost for a minute there. The strategies for differentiating between different products were a key component of industrial expansion, essentially manufacturing demand in order to meet the supply at this rate. They would use things like brand names, money-back guarantees or rebates or other things like that, endorsements from popular celebrities or personalities, and other gimmicks to get people to buy their product. They would also foster loyalty through the development of unique products. For example, George Eastman invented the Kodak camera, and you would get a Kodak camera, you would go and you take all the pictures, you would send the camera back to Kodak. They would take the film out, process your pictures, reload the camera with new film, and then send your camera and your pictures back to you through the mail. And so essentially he always had business, because if you wanted to get any of your pictures developed, you always had to mail it to him. And this is essentially an example of those kind of unique products. By 1900, the early chaos of industrial competition gave way to one of the most productive economies in the world. Vast expansion brought social benefits through labor-saving devices, lower prices, and advances in transportation and communication. Benefits and liabilities were, however, very intimately connected. Sewing machines, for example, created jobs and eased the lives of housewives, but they also fostered the growth of things like sweatshops, where poor workers would toil for long hours at bad wages. Growth also tended to devastate the environment. Rivers were polluted with oil or chemical waste, the skies were filled with soot, the landscape was littered with garbage, and so no advance comes without its particular drawbacks as well. The South had trouble industrializing largely because of the lack of capital following the devastation of the Civil War. So many banks failed, and federal policies required $50,000 startup in order to open a new bank, and that really only exacerbated the problem. The lack of banks meant often that storekeepers became bankers by default, lending supplies in return for a mortgage on crops. The burden of paying these liens tapped farmers, or trapped rather, farmers on their land and created a shortage of labor that was needed for industrialization. And so the South remained largely agricultural because of this system, this crop lean system. The shift to specialized farming of cotton or tobacco made small farmers also vulnerable to market fluctuations because anytime the prices of either of those things were depressed, then you would essentially have a bad year. And when prices fell, farmers often found themselves becoming desperate. The chronic shortage of funds in the South also affected the economy in the nation generally. Limited resources were available for education. There was some expansion of public schools following the Civil War, but a lot of states refused to tax property in order to support the schools, and so attendance stayed low. In order for industrialization to work properly, you needed at least a minimally educated population to operate the machines. Governments also tended to pay veterans pensions, which ate up a significant portion of their budgets, their state budgets. Despite all these obstacles, though, some newspaper editors championed what they called the New Southern Creed. Rich coal and timber resources, as well as cheap labor, made the South ideal for industrial development, and the movement began to gain momentum in the 1880s. Huge tax exemptions were offered to new businesses from state governments. They would lease out convicts as labor, and some gave huge tracts of land to railroads. They sold forest and mineral rights to other companies. Eventually, Southern Iron and Steel expanded, making Birmingham, Alabama, a rapidly growing center of steel production with its rich coal and ore deposits nearby. Mills also contributed to the migration of Southern blacks to the cities, and industry reflected the patterns of racial segregation as well. Southern segregation restricted employment in a number of different ways, but it also opened up some new opportunities. There were opportunities aplenty for black barbers or doctors or restaurant owners or people who were willing to cater to a population that wasn't allowed to use other services. Generally, however, economic opportunity was severely limited for this portion of the population. Unlike urban-based iron and textile mills, these in the South tended to spring up in the countryside. By 1920, the South was a leading textile mill center. An expansion of the industry nurtured this vision of a more prosperous and industrialized South. Cotton mills were first hailed by sharecroppers and tenant farmers as a way out of poverty, but it ended up being just a different type of poverty. Entrepreneurs shamelessly exploited workers, paying only about 50% of what workers got in New England, working in factories there. And often they didn't have the money to move to New England in order to get better wages either. And so they were sort of stuck between a rock and a hard place. Industry progressed much slower in the South and tended to depend on outside financing and technological expertise coming into the South and setting up businesses there. The economy remained essentially at its colonial status, dominated by northern industries and financial syndicates. Many factors combined in order to slow that industrialization: heavy banking regulations, persistent wartime debts, lack of experience and education, and segregation and discrimination all contributed to the slowness of industrialization in the South. Like in the North, industrialization did also bring similar environmental changes and challenges. Changes in production methods in factories also had profound impacts on skilled and unskilled workers alike. Fundamental restructuring of work habits, with an emphasis on discipline, the use of machinery all eroded the status of skilled workers, and skilled workers were quite often replaced by lower paid, less skilled workers. The expansion of the factory system also spawned an unprecedented demand for unskilled labor. This often took the form of seasonal help, people who were hired on in good times and then laid off whenever demand sloughed off as well. They tended to drift from industry to industry and from town to town, never really putting down any kind of roots anywhere. Both skilled and unskilled workers worked 12-hour shifts and were faced with grave hazards to their health and safety. Children were perhaps the most vulnerable to these kind of problems. Many children who worked were often compelled to do so rather than attend school, and the lack of education, as well as physical trauma, could often preclude them from earning better jobs as adults later in life. And so they were essentially starting their race a leg behind. The most perilous jobs for adults were in the railroad. Those that would be sort of injured by accident there were often ostracized by city ordinances or removed as unsightly beggars, which sort of handicapped their efforts in favor of health and safety regulations because out of sight, out of mind, basically. Disabled workers also received minimal financial aid from employers, and so if you were unfortunate enough to be disabled at work, then you were pretty much up a creek without a paddle as far as any sort of future aid. A lot of factory muscle was supplied by unskilled immigrants doing some of the more dangerous or undesirable jobs, but those that lived frugally and managed to work an 84 or so hour week could save as much as $15 a month, which was far more than they would be able to earn at home. Most were keen to work hard, but found it difficult to adjust to the sort of fast-paced work environment that you saw in early American industry. Machines basically dictated the speed at which you worked. Time clocks and rigid schedules also partitioned your day into little chunks. Employers used a variety of tactics to try and enforce discipline. They would sponsor temperance societies and Sunday schools in order to discourage things like drinking. They would cut wages. They provided low-cost housing, which, should you take it, made you even more dependent on your employer than you might have been otherwise. Workers from Southern Europe, who often had darker skin, were considered to be non-white, and thus did not need or desire the same kind of compensation, and so tended to get lower wages than white workers did. Women's work experience also was shaped by their marital status, social class, as well as race. Upper-class married women found it relatively easy to accept the idea of separate spheres, or to continue to accept the idea of separate spheres. But working-class women often found that they had to contribute to the family coffers in order for the family to survive. Young working-class single women also saw the factory as an opportunity. In 1870, most of the women working outside the home worked as domestic servants. But many were abandoning that domestic servant sort of sphere in favor of higher-paying factory work. Racial discrimination, barred many black women from following this path, and in fact, they received a kind of double whammy of discrimination by being both black and female. There were several factors that propelled the rise of employment of single women. Changes in agriculture saw farm women starting to seek industrial employment because quite often agricultural work was now dominated by machines and things like that. Things that women weren't always welcome to participate in or physically couldn't use and participate in. And so they found themselves leaving the farm at an earlier age in order to find a job in the big city. Immigrant parents also would send their daughters to work in factories. Despite the low wages, the long hours, the unpleasant conditions, and various other factors, many young women relished the idea of earning their own income and joined the workforce in ever-growing numbers. When devices like the typewriter and the telephone came into general use, office work also provided new opportunities for women, especially those who managed to have high school educations. They could do clerical jobs that had been recently vacated by men who were able to find better opportunities elsewhere. And these jobs came with higher prestige, and the work tended to be far steadier than factory work and much less dependent on market fluctuations. A lot of so-called opinion molders preached the idea that a man could achieve success in the new industrial era through hard work and dedication. There were, of course, some who were critical of this idea. Mark Twain argued that if one was naive enough to believe that, and that success actually probably came mostly through lying and cheating. Studies at the largest corporations show actually that very few were able to rise from poverty to colossal wealth, sort of rags to riches type ideas. About 95% of those more successful individuals came from middle class and upper class backgrounds. Very few were able to make immense fortunes, rags to riches, but many were able to improve their standard of living. So rags to not rags. Skilled workers found it relatively easy to sort of climb the corporate ladder, if you like. They could become owners of their own companies, but opportunities for unskilled workers were far more limited. Some did manage to move up, but most immigrants, for example, moved far more slowly than the sons of the middle class and the upper class who had better educations as well as familial financial backing. Rags to respectability was a much more attainable goal. However, the idea remained as part of the sort of working class goal. You do see a rise in real wages at this time, but the gains were somewhat undercut by the constant fear of injuries or unemployment. So, the growth of all these large corporations gave industrialists an unprecedented amount of power to control the workplace, and so labor leaders looked for ways to protect their members from that power. The problems that they faced was manyfold. Employers tended to highlight ethnic and racial differences in order to divide the labor force, kind of artificially, if you like. Skilled workers also felt very little kinship with unskilled workers, and so the desire to unite was tempered as a result of that. Unions also, at the time, tended to be divided by different trades, and many of them saw very little reason to work together. And so all of this lessened the impact of labor unions as they existed prior to this period. Eventually, you get the National Labor Union founded, and this was inspired by this vision of a nationwide association. They endorsed various things like an 8-hour workday, end to convict labor, currency and banking reform, higher wages, immigrant restriction, especially Chinese immigrants, who were seen as undercutting wage levels. They supported the cause of working women, urged unionization of black workers, although in segregated unions. And the founder eventually turned to political reform, but his union was relatively short-lived, and dissolved quite quickly after his death. In 1869, we see the introduction of the Knights of Labor. This group welcomed all wage earners, demanded things like the equal pay for women, an end to child and convict labor, co-op ownership of factories, mines, and other businesses, progressive taxes on all earnings, graduated based on income, and other popular labor measures. This organization grew relatively slowly at first, but after 1880, membership skyrockets. This reflected both the idealistic origins as well as new leadership, which came about in that period. The new leader, a man called Powderly, opposed strikes and urged temperance, advocated membership for black workers and women, supported immigration restrictions as well as a total ban on the Chinese, and actually aided in the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was passed in 1882. In 1885, the Wabash Railroad began firing active union members, and so members staged a walkout. The action crippled operations and eventually forced a concession from the railroad, and it represented the first real union victory against an industrialist. Membership soared after that, and as a result achieved a lot of political success, but their strength waned soon after that. Workers became disillusioned by a succession of failed strikes, and so began to drift away from the organization. And a lot of the reason that those strikes failed was because union leadership was having a hard time keeping a handle on local chapters. Essentially, you had chapters who were acting without the full support of the national organization, and those rogue chapters saw failed strikes, which in turn disillusioned members, and so weakened the national organization as well. As this organization was declining, another organization which was pursuing much more immediate and practical goals began to emerge, and this became known as the American Federation of Labor. The Knights of Labor tended to be fairly high-minded in their ideals. They tended to go or to involve themselves in a lot of political type quandaries where they would concern themselves with things like currency reform and other big issues like that, which, while they did affect laborers, they didn't affect them immediately. And they tended to be a bit more abstract than to the actual sort of member, sort of dues-paying member of the organization. And because they tended to focus on those things, the labor union itself seemed to somehow lack focus as a result of that. The American Federation of Labor concerned itself with much more practical goals, like higher wages and shorter work days, which is something that, if achieved, the average member would feel the effects of immediately. Skilled craft unions were also concerned by an association that welcomed both skilled and unskilled workers. They were also concerned that broad reform goals would undercut the commitment to the sort of bread and butter things like better wages and reducing hours. The leaders of this organization also felt that large-scale industry organizations necessitated a comparable degree of organization on the part of labor. If you're going to have large monopolies, you essentially need to have an equally large labor organization so that both sides can come to the table on relatively even footing. They knew that trade unions retained a very strong sense of independence, and so they created a federation of unions linked by an executive council that could coordinate strategy. So you essentially combine all the different trade unions into one giant federation so that you can both enjoy your independence and also enjoy the benefits of combination. They sidestepped the more decisive or divisive political issues and focused on short-term improvements, like demanding an 8-hour workday, workers' compensation, mine safety laws, those things. Unions before 1900 generally remained relatively weak as far as influence, and in fact less than 5% of workers tended to join these unions in the period before 1900. They were quite often split by skill level, ethnicity, religion, tactics, and the fact that unions were only occasionally effective at achieving their goals. Labor clashes toward the end of the 19th century continued the pattern of violence that marked much of history of American labor. In 1881 to 1905, there were nearly 37,000 strikes, with some of the bigger ones resulting in sort of massive loss of property, loss of life, and other things like that. In 1873, a Wall Street crash triggers a depression, and there's a wave of strikes following that. Businesses closed down or cut wages and laid off workers. And in 1877, you have a kind of wildcat railroad strike, which spread all over the country. Strikers destroyed property. Eventually, federal troops were called in to try and end the strike 2 weeks later. And by the end, almost 100 people had died, and 2/3 of the railroads in the country were shut down as a result. This rather violent outbreak stunned the middle class, and employers used that fear to crack down on labor. People were encouraged to sign yellow dog contracts, essentially stating that they promised never to join a labor union. Businesses hired Pinkerton detectives to defend factories or turned to the government for military support in putting down strikes. The economy eventually recovered, but more strikes and violence soon followed. In May of 1886, Chicago police shot and killed 4 strikers at the McCormick Harvester plant. A protest in Haymarket Square the following day resulted in someone throwing a bomb, which killed or wounded several policemen. And police responded to that by firing into the crowd and killed 4 other people. The public responded by lashing out against labor, and particularly the connection to the anarchist movement. It's highly unlikely that the anarchists were actually labor union members. What's more likely is that the anarchists simply took advantage of the protest to make their own statement, which could have possibly included throwing the bomb. It's unclear still as to where the bomb actually came from. Eventually, 8 suspected anarchists were arrested for the Haymarket incident, although there was no real evidence to connect them to the bombing, and all of them were convicted for the crime. However, only 4 of them were executed. This only served to further increase animosity towards labor unions. In 1894, there was a strike at the Pullman factory. Pullman made rail cars, and they decided to slash wages in response to an 1893 depression, and thousands of the newly formed American Railway Union went on strike. They were part of the American Federation of Labor, and were led by a man called Eugene V. Debs. They refused to move the trains with Pullman cars on them, which effectively paralyzed traffic in the Chicago area, Chicago being a major hub for train traffic, with about 2,000 or so trains terminating or starting in Chicago. The real problem came when trains that were moving the mail around were attached to Pullman cars, and therefore the railroad workers refused to move them, and it stopped the travel of the mail. There was an attempt to break up the union by bringing in strike breakers, or people who had crossed the picket line, as you like to say, or as they like to say. They petitioned for a federal injunction because the workers refused to move the mail cars. In response to that court injunction, Debs refused to order the workers to go back to work, and so was subsequently arrested. Federal troops were eventually sent in order to crush the strike, and business leaders learned a valuable lesson, and that was that court injunctions could be very effective at breaking up strikes. They also worked very hard to play on the popular connection between unions and violent anarchists to secure a state and federal support for crippling the union's ability to bargain with business. Overall, the efforts to build a national working class labor movement achieved very limited success in the 19th century. They were hampered by employer associations and conservative state and local officials. Their many difficulties meant that unions were not able to expand their base, nor were they able to shed their negative public image well until the 1930s or so. The question remained, however, or became, however, should the government become the mechanism for helping the poor and for regulating big business? Should we take a major step away from the pro-business attitude that had dominated American government since the colonial period, really? Defenders of capitalism preached a policy of laissez-faire, insisting that government should never attempt to control business. Adam Smith is the person credited with laissez-faire, although its 19th century interpretation is actually fundamentally flawed. Adam Smith's original argument was that there is an invisible hand which automatically regulates the supply and demand for goods and services, and that this invisible hand should be left to do its work. In the 19th century, that invisible hand is somewhat less invisible, in that the 19th century is quite often characterized by pro-business policies, and anything that might hamper business is seen as a affront to laissez-faire, when in fact pro-business policies are also an affront to Adam Smith's original idea of laissez-faire. Adam Smith was originally writing in response to the growth of mercantilist policies in Europe at the time. However, in the 19th century, laissez-faire, in the 19th century America, laissez-faire was characterized by opposition to any kind of business regulation, labor unions, things like that. Andrew Carnegie justified laissez-faire by applying evolutionary theories to human society. In his essay that I mentioned, William Graham Sumner, who's another essay that we have available for us in the readings, also used evolution as applied to human society. And this idea of applying evolutionary theories to society became known as social Darwinism. The argument being that natural laws controlled social order, as well as biological order, and that the state owes nothing but law, order, and basic political rights to its citizenry. Everything else needs to be left to essentially a system of natural selection, of societal natural selection. There were, of course, a number of challenges to the ideas of social Darwinism. A man called Lester Frank Ward challenged Sumner directly by arguing that those laws of nature can be circumvented by human will. Scientists use knowledge to breed better livestock, and so should government use its power to regulate business and protect weaker members of the environment, essentially building a stronger society. Henry George famously published a book called Progress and Poverty, and he proposed a solution to the problem through the application of a single tax system. Edward Bellamy took a different approach to his challenge of social Darwinism through the publication of a novel entitled Looking Backward. This novel describes a vision of a harmonious industrialized society in the year 2000. In the book, a man falls asleep in the year 1888 and wakes up in the year 2000 to a world that is run by a state-run, or features a state-run economy where everyone works for the common good. These authors and arguers did not deny the benefits of the industrial order. They merely sought to humanize it, to make it a bit kinder. Socialists had a different view, which essentially rested on the labor theory of value, meaning that labor required to produce a commodity was the only true measure of that item's value. Profits made by an employer was surplus value appropriated from the exploited workers, essentially taking away what the workers had rightly earned in order to line his own pockets. This idea was not a particularly powerful force in 19th century American thought. Most were more worried about the anarchists, who preached the destruction of capitalism and the general overthrow of government in order to form a stateless utopia, an idea which was far more frightening to 19th century Americans than any of the other ones proposed.